One problem with talking about animal-based food comes with the potential environmental consequences and impact of, for example, from cows, you have methane production that they're able to produce. And that has been a question mark on regards to beef and cows and how that is possibly affecting greenhouse gas emissions and methane being a gas that is supposed to be. I was reading someplace that from 50 to 80 times more than carbon dioxide. What is
Mm.
your knowledge on this, and how do you justify this given that this could be significantly injurious to health and possibly global warming?
Well, I think it's highly questionable to say that the methane per se is a health risk, right? So let's put that off the side. Um, the production of methane, enteric methane from ruminant digestion, is a completely natural process. It happens in livestock and in wildlife, um, and in fact, in many insects. Um, One estimate reported last spring said that there are comparable greenhouse emissions from wildlife dominated savannas and livestock dominated savannas in Eastern Africa. So some of this is going to happen as a result of the natural carbon cycle. And because of the nature of the conversation, we have this artificial division between natural and man-made or man-influenced impacts. Number
Yeah,
two, everything
just
we
to
do has an impact.
yeah, Peter, the biggest discussion that goes around animal-based protein, and especially from the environmental standpoint, and we really got to talk about this because this is a big question that people have in their mind. That people do generally think that yes, cows are injurious to the environment,
Yeah,
and so that is a big question that people do talk about, and it's difficult to not talk about it. That is sort of the problem here.
yeah. Sure, absolutely. No, I completely understand. I think it's fair to point out that a lot of this is misinformation that's promoted with an agenda, right? So you can accuse me of having a bias, and fair enough. There's no such thing as a point of view that's nobody's point of view. I'm merely pointing out that we've had things like you said 50, 80 times, the number's closer to 28, 25 times. And even that's in dispute of the warming potential of methane versus CO2. I mentioned earlier that there's a carbon cycle that takes place in the environment. What I mean by that is we have CO2 in the atmosphere at a very low percentage when we look at percentage of atmospheric composition. Photosynthesis is the process by which radiant energy from the sun is utilized to take CO2 and water and reduce the CO2 to carbohydrate. And from that, then we have fiber, we have sugar, etc. Or first sugar, which fiber is made out of, and oxygen. Those are the products of photosynthesis. So when we're talking about grassland or other forage, we have photosynthesis that's building plant material that the cow then eats. So some portion of that is then burped out as methane. Well, that methane in the atmosphere is oxidized to CO2 within about 10 years. So we have the cycling of CO2 through photosynthesis, the plants, the cow, back to the atmosphere within about 10 years. It's a cycling of CO2 as compared to when we extract natural gas or when we have coal mining, we have fossil energy, which really is the driver of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So we've not been having sincere conversations about this subject. And there's a number of points that I can bring up. And I'm going to get really controversial here. And I'm going to say we have far better quality evidence that your child is far more likely, by orders of magnitude, more likely to be harmed by putting it on a vegan diet than whatever we're anticipating from disastrous anthropogenic greenhouse climate change, right? So, we're having the wrong conversations. Human beings today are being harmed by too little animal source foods. We have conversations about some imagined harm from too much, which really is only based on nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease, very questionable discipline. We also have these overstatements of environmental impacts. Again, we have natural grasslands, which are our most endangered biome globally. They're critical for watershed, they're critical for soil stewardship, they're critical for carbon sequestration globally. What did I just see? If we could mitigate, if we could restore the degraded grasslands, they could sequester sufficient carbon to that would be equivalent to about 50 parts per million per year sequestered. And there's all kinds of problems with those statements. There's a minimum that if we get below, then photosynthesis declines. All of these kinds of things. It's all very a richer, more nuanced conversation than we've been allowed to have. But let's say that we were to eliminate animal agriculture in the United States. What kind of impact would that have? Well, there was a study that looked at the question, and they said that if we were to do that, it would only reduce US greenhouse gas emissions by about 2.4%. That's all livestock agriculture, including horses, including pets.
Right. I was able to, since you were talking, I was able to pull up a graphic that does speak to what you were suggesting. And it does show that ruminant agriculture
Mhm.
is actually not such a huge cause of greenhouse gas emissions, at least in the US. And within the
Indeed.
livestock category, yeah, cattle
Yeah.
represent just about 2% of all US greenhouse gas emissions. And as you
Right.
mentioned, there's a cycle, and maybe that is one of the reasons that the overall effect from emissions from livestock is not as much when you compare to electricity generation and transportation and the industry.
And yet we have heard things like, right, that cows emit more than transportation. Well, that was flawed. The study was retracted, but it's one of these zombie myths that just lives forever, despite being retracted by its own authors. There are many, many issues in here that we could say the same thing about. Of course, people imagine some natural world that really probably never existed. So part of our challenge is that nature is not abundant. And we have to do things to increase the production of biomass. Essentially, that's what agriculture is. We're producing more biomass. Now, the vast majority of that biomass we can't eat directly. So when we grow a crop of corn or we grow a crop of wheat, more than half of that biomass is not human edible. One study out of Europe said that for every pound, kilo, they said, but it would be the same, for every pound of vegan food, that was their term, produced, 4 to 5 pounds of inedible biomass are produced. What are you going to do with that? Well, one of the things that we're currently doing is we're using that as a feed resource to produce livestock products. So it's part of this system of utilizing these resources. And there's lots of reasons why we should continue to do that. And for the most part, a lot of people don't understand these sort of things because they're not in agriculture. Fine, we need to get better at communicating.
No, definitely. And it seems from this discussion that there definitely needs to be a much broader discussion and a much more open and frank and free discussion. um, it gets to
Hmm.
be difficult
Hmm.
when mostly what you hear on the airways and print media is largely that this methane is deadly and it's accounting for a lot. And a lot of times, people do suggest that, okay, if you are eating meat or cow, you are actually not a good human being. I think that is something
Yeah.
that is out there. I've heard of it myself.
Hmm.
Although there's always nuances, as you are mentioning, and it may not be 100% accurate what people are suggesting. So yeah, I think we definitely
Yeah.
need more discussion on these topics.
Well, you'll notice that the conversation well, I've noticed that the conversation has shifted a little bit. The Malthusian catastrophists uh, have shifted from talking about enteric methane to now talking about methane leaks. Right. So they're shifting again. There's a lot of this goalpost shifting that takes place. So they'll ride one argument until people refute it, and then they'll move. And frequently, then, unfortunately, the general public doesn't know what game is being played. So they don't know how to, and so they're still hearing what they heard and don't understand. The issues that are in play are nothing short of essential to human flourishing globally. And we've had repeated instances in many countries where people are getting to the end of their tolerance for some of these ideas because there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And some proponents come along and they say, oh, it'll all be wonderful if you just do this. And politicians, they have to be seen to be doing something, because this is a crisis and we have to address this crisis. Well, they don't really always have all the information at their hands, and they want to be reelected. And so whatever, so they go ahead and then when the predictable results come due, okay, now it's a new crisis. So they have to find something, there is a lot of this going on. We have to understand that if we stop eating animal source foods, what's the alternative? Where does that come from? Well, is it going to come from more crop source foods produced? Where's that going to take place? When we produce these crops for human utilization, where does that take place? That has impacts. We're not always good at looking at that. And if we're going to have a fair and frank exchange of ideas, what's the environmental impact of the healthcare industry? Well, I can pull out the one estimate that said that the US healthcare industry is a significant source of pollution, including 10% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. 10. You just showed a figure that said all of livestock agriculture is less than 4 and beef is 2. Now, it's fair to say those are not apples to apples comparisons, right? Because in the healthcare estimate, they said how much energy is being used, right? How much food is being served? How much transportation is involved? All fair questions, right? The point is that the healthcare industry itself has a discernible and to this point, not well quantified environmental impact. And yet we know that malnutrition is the driver of US healthcare costs, and globally
Definitely,
the
yes.
same thing. And
Yeah.
so if I'm right that animal source food is essential for proper nourishment, and therefore for avoiding a significant portion of the chronic disease burden, which is the driver of healthcare in the United States, well then, how do we do the trade-offs, right? Because everything we do has impacts. I'm willing, now it may be my bias, I'm willing to entertain the notion of well-managed grasslands for the production of animal source foods to lower the healthcare burden, among other things, as well as producing ecosystem services like watershed health, like wildlife diversity, like diversity of plant species, as well as animals, as well as insects, fire mitigation in some areas where if we don't graze these, the fuel builds up and brush encroachment, which then leads to hazards. So there's a number of things, as well as, oh, by the way, new wealth creation, right? Something like 700 million of the world's poorest people are pastoralists. They're dependent on herding and raising livestock. So these people that entertain these notions in the high income countries, how's that going to be manifest in the rest of the world? And I'm not above trying to get these people to experience a bit of shame over their naive at best and malevolent in practice, if not intent, ideas.
No, definitely. And for example, in Africa, especially, you heard of the Maasai people. They live off cows, cattle, I believe, and they drink the milk, they drink the blood, and that's they probably consume the meat. So that's how a lot of
Mhm.
people live. And in many of these traditional societies, where people have cattle, sheep, and that's how they live. If you take that away, they will lose a certain degree or a huge degree of their livelihood. And it just can't be one size fits all. I think there has to be a mixture, and a lot of consideration needs to go into this. And of course, a bigger and broader discussion needs to go into what's actually is happening. And a lot of things, as you mentioned, get politicized. And hopefully, we don't,
Yeah.
stay in that, and we go towards a more objective approach on these matters, which is very essential. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you as a valuable viewer. And if you liked this segment, you can watch all of the different individual segments or the whole podcast to have a broader understanding on this topic. Just check the links in the description or what you see on the screen right now. I'm Dr. Umer Khan. Looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you.